Today, Hyundai and Kia cars can be easily found on the roads of almost any country in the world. But it was not always like this. In 1953, South Korea emerged from the Korean War completely broke, in desperate poverty. Its economy was almost entirely agricultural. Infrastructure left over from the period of Japanese occupation was completely destroyed, and nearly all industry was concentrated in the north, where a different state had emerged. In 1960, South Korea's GDP per capita was only about $100, lower than in Ethiopia, Uganda, or Zimbabwe, and just 8.5 of the US level at the time. Imagine a country poorer than Africa of that era with no technology or capital. It seemed like it had no chance. But soon, everything began to change. Over the past 50 years, South Korea's economy has grown at an average rate of about 7 per year. Compared to the early 1960s, GDP per capita has increased 26 times. Think about it, a 26-fold increase. A journey from one of the poorest countries to a technological giant in just one generation. Today, it is one of the world's most complex and technologically advanced economies, producing everything from smartphones to automobiles. Korean industrial products now successfully compete in global markets with long-established giants, and the automotive industry played a major role in the success. But how was this possible? Today, we will explain how a policy of the carrot and the stick led to the creation of one of the most efficient automotive industries in the world. When the so-called father of the economic miracle, Park Chung-hee, came to power, the country was drowning in problems. Today, Hyundai and Kia cars can be easily found on the roads of almost any country in the world. But it was not always like this. In 1953, South Korea emerged from the Korean War completely broke, in desperate poverty. Its economy was almost entirely agricultural. Infrastructure left over from the period of Japanese occupation was completely destroyed, and nearly all industry was concentrated in the north, where a different state had emerged. In 1960, South Korea's GDP per capita was only about $100, lower than in Ethiopia, Uganda, or Zimbabwe, and just 8.5 of the US level at the time. Imagine a country poorer than Africa of that era, with no technology or capital. It seemed like it had no chance. But soon, everything began to change. Over the past 50 years, South Korea's economy has grown at an average rate of about 7 per year. Compared to the early 1960s, GDP per capita has increased 26 times. Think about it, a 26-fold increase. A journey from one of the poorest countries to a technological giant in just one generation. Today, it is one of the world's most complex and technologically advanced economies, producing everything from smartphones to automobiles. Korean industrial products now successfully compete in global markets with long-established giants, and the automotive industry played a major role in this success. But how was this possible? Today, we will explain how a policy of the carrot and the stick led to the creation of one of the most efficient automotive industries in the world. When the so-called father of the economic miracle, Park Chung-hee, came to power, the country was drowning in problems. In 1960, the April Revolution overthrew the Syngman-rhee regime. However, the new government failed to restore order, and the country descended into even greater turmoil. In 1961, General Park Chung-hee seized power. Under US pressure, a referendum was held and South Korea returned to presidential rule. At first, Park did not plan to run, but a military conspiracy he uncovered changed everything. He resigned from the army, entered the election, and won by a margin of just 1.5. A tiny gap, but with enormous consequences. His main trump card was his economic program. Park firmly believed that only a strong economy could give the country real sovereignty. This marked the beginning of the reforms that led to the miracle on the Han River and laid the foundation for South Korea's automotive industry. In today's digital world, one thing is inevitable: constant skill renewal. New tools, technologies, and work methods appear faster than we can adapt to the previous ones. For those already in a profession, this is not just a challenge, it is a necessity. To remain in demand and move upward, it is crucial not only to stay up to date, but also to systematically develop key competencies. Park Chung-hee's reforms were built on strict centralization of power and 5-year plans, almost like in the USSR, but with a different goal. The main objective was exports. In the 1950s, imports exceeded exports by 15 times, and the country survived on foreign aid. Park bet everything on industry. Either we sell abroad, or we remain in poverty. The state supported only those industries and companies that committed to exporting. Failed to meet the plan, say goodbye to privileges. At the same time, imports of finished products were sharply restricted through tariffs. Companies were given everything they needed: cheap loans, tax breaks, government orders, access to foreign currency, and access to foreign equipment. Let's look at how this mechanism worked in practice. Step 1: selection of candidates. Relevant ministries together with banks determined which industries and firms would receive priority. Enterprises were chosen based on their potential and current performance. Step 2: resources under conditions. Companies were given location, production volumes, export volumes. Step 3: monitoring and adjustment. Banks and ministries monitored compliance with the conditions. If targets were met, support was increased. If not, it was reduced and resources were redirected to others. Step 4: the carrot and the stick. Successful companies received new resources and grew. Failed ones lost support, sank into debt, and were placed under external management. Viable firms were restructured. Hopeless ones were sold off or handed over to stronger players. This system concentrated capacity in the hands of the strongest and forced everyone else to work better. Companies that failed to meet targets could even be publicly shamed by the government in the press, effectively putting an end to their future. Park Chung-hee's main priority was exports. State support directly depended on competitiveness in the global market. But in the 1960s, Korea remained an agrarian country, no industrial base, no technology, no capital. Therefore, development began with light industry, but always with a focus on exports. A vivid example is wigs. In 1963, volumes were modest, but by 1970, exports had already reached $93, accounting for 9 of the country's total exports. At first glance, wigs, but in reality millions of dollars and a step toward the miracle on the Han River. But what about automobiles? Were they waiting their turn alongside heavy industry, or did they develop in parallel? In 1962, South Korea produced only 1710 passenger cars and 67 commercial vehicles. Imagine the scale: just a few thousand cars for the entire country. Until 1966, production continued to decline. Only in the second half of the 1960s did South Korea's automotive industry begin to grow rapidly, producing 19,500 passenger cars and 11,500 commercial vehicles by 1969. This was a breakthrough. Passenger cars increased more than 11 times, and commercial vehicles more than 170 times compared to 1962. However, at first, this was not full-cycle production. At the start, the CKD scheme was used. Simply put, fully disassembled imported cars were brought into the country and only assembled in South Korea. In 1962, the government passed the Automobile Industry Protection Act. It contained 3 simple rules. Car assembly companies were exempt from taxes, parts and components were exempt from import duties, and imports of fully assembled cars were strictly prohibited. But who was destined to become the direct executor of the government's plans to develop South Korea's economy? What do you think? During the Japanese occupation, Koreans had very few of their own companies. When the Japanese left, local businessmen received their assets. The land reform of the late 1940s weakened communists, increased agricultural productivity, and gave new entrepreneurs a chance. Early Korean businesses were often family-owned. They grew, but control remained within families. Under Syngman Rhee, enterprises became tightly intertwined with politicians' bribes, kickbacks, government contracts. This is how clan capitalism was born. Park Chung-hee came to power with a slogan of fighting corruption. At the start, the CKD scheme was used. Simply put, fully disassembled imported cars were brought into the country and only assembled in South Korea. In 1962, the government passed the Automobile Industry Protection Act. It contained 3 simple rules. Car assembly companies were exempt from taxes, parts, and components were exempt from import duties, and imports of fully assembled cars were strictly prohibited. But who was destined to become the direct executor of the government's plans to develop South Korea's economy? What do you think? During the Japanese occupation, Koreans had very few of their own companies. When the Japanese left, local businessmen received their assets. The land reform of the late 1940s weakened communists, increased agricultural productivity, and gave new entrepreneurs a chance. Early Korean businesses were often family-owned. They grew, but control remained within families. Under Syngman Rhee, enterprises became tightly intertwined with politicians, bribes, kickbacks, government contracts. This is how clan capitalism was born. Park Chung-hee came to power with a slogan of fighting corruption. The choice fell on Sear Motors, which became the first Korean automotive company operating under the CKD scheme. Starting in 1962, it assembled the Datsun Bluebird P310, made possible thanks to historical ties with Japan and a license from Nissan, which invested $35 million in technological equipment for the plant in South Korea. The license itself was not obtained by chance, but through a donation to the Democratic Republican Party, led by Park Chung-hee himself. In essence, this was a corrupt scheme for obtaining a license. Sear Motors purchased components for 130,000 won and planned to sell the car for 250,000 won. What do you think could go wrong? The car turned out to be too expensive for the poor South Korean consumer, and production volumes failed to scale properly. And then came the outcome. In the spring of 1963, when the government faced a foreign currency shortage, the authorities revoked the company's right to import components. In May of the same year, assembly stopped, and Snara Motors, having failed to meet its obligations, collapsed within 2 months. Its assets were transferred to joint control of the Ministry of Trade and Industry and the creditor bank. During its short history in automobile assembly, the company produced only 2,073 vehicles. Snara Motors was acquired by Seein Industrial in 1965, which later changed its name to Seein Motors after establishing cooperation with Japan's Toyota. Thus, already in the first half of the 1960s, the carrot and stick of South Korea's industrial policy made itself felt. Only from 1966 did the TKD model begin to gain momentum. The practice of assigning all assembly to a single company was abandoned in favor of competition among firms, which significantly revitalized the market. Other assembly enterprises appeared in the country. For example, Kia Industries, which had launched licensed assembly of Kia Honda Kone 100 motorcycles back in 1961, by the end of the decade, in partnership with Mazda, had established production of 3-wheeled light trucks T2000 and T600. These modest-looking vehicles gained wide popularity, generating funds for the development of proprietary vehicles and allowing the company to invest in its own automobile designs. In 1966, Asia Motors was founded, and in 1968, Hyundai Motor Company, which initially received technical support from Ford and later from Mitsubishi. Familiar names, right? Thus, by 1970, 4 key automakers had formed in South Korea: Kia, Hyundai, Asia Motors, and CE. There was also On, the predecessor of Ssangyong, which focused on commercial and specialized vehicles. Remember these names, they would soon set the tone for the market. However, requirements for the localization of components and production volume targets were never lifted. If in the mid-1960s the share of domestically produced parts in a finished vehicle was around 20, by the end of the 1970s it reached 90. This was not a slogan, but a plan with strict deadlines. But how was this achieved? Keep watching. Licensed assembly in the 1960s laid the foundation for the automotive industry, and rapid growth transformed Korea from a poor country into a middle-income economy. In 1973, the ACI program was launched, accelerated development of heavy and chemical industries. Park Chung-hye identified key sectors: steel, petrochemicals, automotive manufacturing, machine tools, shipbuilding, and electronics. The program was adopted under pressure from external threats. The North was increasing its military capabilities, and the United States could reduce its presence due to the Vietnam War. There was only one solution: concentrate resources on industries that would both develop the economy and strengthen national defense. The automotive industry, relying on steel, mechanical engineering, and chemicals, became a priority. Benefits were granted only to companies with exports, localization, and ties to global corporations. Banks strictly controlled projects, finances, and personnel. The system worked, but dependence on government financing would later become a problem. The symbol of the transition from licensed assembly to domestic production was the Hyundai Pony. In the late 1960s, Hyundai Motor Company, like other companies in the industry, assembled cars under license from Ford Cortina, but management dreamed of a Korean mass-market car. To achieve this, in 1974, Hyundai invited George Turnbull, who had extensive management experience in British automotive corporations, to lead this ambitious project. He brought in 5 leading British automotive engineers. As a result, using engines and transmissions from Japan's Mitsubishi, its Lancer platform, some Ford Cortina components already produced locally in Korea, and an Italian-designed body, under Western management, the Hyundai Pony hatchback was developed. The concept car was presented at the Turin Motor Show in October 1974, and in December 1975, serial production was announced. 1 year later, the Pony was exported to Latin America, the Middle East, and Africa. While in 1976 just over 1,000 Korean hatchbacks were exported, only 2 years later exports exceeded 18,000 units. The creation of the Hyundai Pony seemed like a small step into the future for its manufacturers, but in reality, it became a giant leap for the entire South Korean automotive industry. The development process of the hatchback became a training ground for local automotive engineers, who mastered mass production vehicle design precisely through the Pony project. The model began to gain recognition abroad, and stable demand emerged both in other developing countries and within South Korea itself. This success expanded government incentives for the creators of the hatchback. Altogether, this opened export markets for South Korean automakers and accelerated the transformation of Hyundai Motor Company into a global player exporting vehicles of its own design and production. Not all Korean automakers succeeded. For example, CN Motors, the successor to the first assembly company, struggled in its cooperation with foreign partners. In 1965, it received a government monopoly on automobile production. And as we already know, a year later the government abandoned the one industry, one firm policy. This did not suit CN Motors. The company tried to regain influence through lobbying and paid less attention to localization of production and exports as required by the government. In the late 1970s, Toyota sought to expand production and exports to China, but China prohibited companies from operating simultaneously in its market and in certain other countries, including South Korea. Due to problems at CN Motors and the attractiveness of the Chinese market, Toyota left Korea in 1972. Toyota was replaced by the American General Motors, which together with CN created General Motors Korea. However, after the first oil shock, CN struggled to cope with the challenges, and the company began experiencing financial difficulties. In 1976, GM asked the Korean government, through the U.S. Embassy, to find another partner. The company's shares were purchased by the Korea Development Bank, and it became Sehan Motor Company. Sehan attempted to save the situation through a partnership with AMC in the production of Jeep vehicles, but this also failed. In 1979, AMC withdrew, and in 1981, Jeep production was spun off into a separate company. 3 years later, all remaining assets came under the control of Donghae Motor, the future Sanjeong Motor. The result of this decade was a transformation in key indicators of the Korean automotive industry. If in 1969, 19,500 passenger vehicles and 11,500 commercial vehicles were produced, then by 1979, these figures had grown to 113,500 and 91,000, respectively. If in 1969 South Korean automobile exports were zero, by 1979 they reached approximately 30,000 vehicles. At the same time, the localization rate increased from 20 to 90. Targeted industrial policy delivered results. In 1985, Hyundai, the leader of South Korea's automotive industry, replaced the Pony with the Hyundai XL. A major success was the car's entry into the highly competitive U.S. market. This was the company's first model sold in the United States. The Pony was banned from sale because it did not meet federal environmental standards. Thanks to its $5,000 price and recognition by Fortune magazine as the 10th best product, the XL broke sales records among imported cars in its first year. In 1988, Hyundai exported nearly 169,000 vehicles of this brand to the United States. 2 years later, the figure exceeded 264,000. Success was not limited to the market leader. In 1988, the entire South Korean automotive industry produced around 1.3 million vehicles, with total exports across all markets exceeding 576,000 units. However, 1989 exports collapsed. U.S. sales of the XL fell to 149,000, and overall foreign shipments of South Korea's automotive industry also declined. The downturn occurred due to problems that emerged with these vehicles in other countries. They broke down frequently. Thus, the new challenge for the South Korean automotive industry was no longer quantity, but quality. This forced companies to invest in their own engines, bodies, and components, improve quality control, marketing, and design. Under pressure from the global economy and consumers, not only the automotive industry but South Korea itself began to change. In 1979, President Park Chung-hee was assassinated. He was replaced by a prime minister who promised democratization, but this failed. In 1980, Chun Doo-hwan became president and ruled until 1988. Under pressure from protests and the United States, he agreed to democratization, but reforms were carried out by the next president, Roh Tae-woo. Since then, South Korea's president has been directly elected every 5 years. Democratization brought market reforms. Protection of the domestic market was reduced. The country and its automotive industry integrated into the global economy. Financial liberalization was carried out. However, the role of large vertically integrated enterprises managed by corporate family clans remained significant. By the mid-1990s, automotive giants were actively entering foreign markets despite intense competition. Under tightening financial conditions, this approach led to a growth in foreign debt among automakers. When the Asian financial crisis erupted in 1997, the collapse of the won caused by capital flight exposed a critical vulnerability: massive debt burdens and dependence on exchange rate dynamics. Kia was hit particularly hard. Production was preserved, but the previous owners lost control of the company. A controlling stake was acquired by Hyundai Motor Company as part of a financial restructuring deal. Another major casualty was Daewoo. In 1999, the Daewoo Chaebol effectively declared insolvency. Asset sales began. The automotive division of the Daewoo conglomerate was sold to General Motors. In Daewoo's collapse, there is one fact that can hardly be called anything other than fate. In 1997, Daewoo Motor acquired a controlling stake in another Chaebol, Ssangyong Motor, which 10 years earlier had taken control of Donghae Motor. That company, in turn, had once acquired the renamed automobile production enterprise of the Jeep brand, which had been owned by CN Motors, which back in the 1960s had absorbed the assets of the first failed automobile assembly company, Serra Motors. It seems history likes to return to where it all began. Since 2011, Daewoo cars have been sold in South Korea under the Chevrolet brand. In most other markets, Daewoo vehicles are no longer produced. Beginning in 2010, South Korea's automotive industry began shifting its focus toward green technologies. Efforts were also made to enhance international competitiveness. Leading automakers actively developed cross-border technological cooperation. Increasing attention has been paid to investments in research and development. Until the introduction of Trump-era tariffs, the government primarily worked on removing export barriers and allocated large grants and tax incentives for research in electric vehicles and autonomous cars. Today, authorities are focused on developing electric vehicles and mitigating external risks associated with the trade wars recently initiated by the United States. In just 60 years, South Korea transformed from an agrarian country into a center of technological innovation. Its success is not accidental, but the result of targeted industrial policy. Incentives went hand in hand with concrete goals, and achieving results opened new horizons for growth. Companies that emerged at the dawn of South Korea's automotive industry became global leaders, surviving severe economic crises of modern times, while weaker players disappeared or were reborn through bankruptcy, restructuring, or changes in ownership. South Korea's automotive industry became what we know today precisely because the state skillfully combined the carrot and the stick. Opportunities expanded, but without real competition for success, they could not be seized. Today, this story shows that ambition and discipline, reinforced by incentives and competition, can transform entire industries and even entire countries into global leaders.